coming back to more themes that tie in with everything else. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. Anne Price Hardister earned a BA and MA in anthropology from the University of Missouri and worked as an archaeologist in the UK, Luxembourg, and the US. I love that because what we do with costume and textiles, I think often is an anthropological, if not strictly archaeological viewpoint. Oh, thank you. In 1993, she earned an MA in museum education from the College of William and Mary, and then embarked on a 30-year career at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation in Williamsburg, Virginia. Yay. As education and training manager, she developed and implemented programs, tours, and training that emphasize a multicultural approach to 17th and 18th century history. She was a member of the special exhibition team that developed the 2019 exhibit Tenacity, which told the story of women of three cultures who lived in and around Jamestown in the early 17th century. For the past 10 years, she has been researching early Virginia quilts, the women who created them, and their family and community connections. Please welcome Anne Hardister.
Thank you. Here's your clicker. Okay, here's your, this is forward, this is back. This is forward, that's back. Glad I knew that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say a few words to give you some background about, to give you a little background on this paper. For several years, I have been researching the Robinson Crusoe quilt, so-called, that you're going to meet in a minute, and several other quilts like it, central medallion quilts made in Virginia in the early 19th century. This quilt kept calling me back, though. There were issues about it that I wanted to explore. It had been written about extensively already. It was written about by Gloria Seaman Allen in First Flowerings here at the DAR Museum, the catalog and book that go with that. Any of you who won that book yesterday, the quilt is in it. In Sandy Fox's figurative quilts, or wrapped in glory figurative quilts, 1700 to 1900, and another article by Gloria Seaman Allen that featured a comparison of the possible maker of this quilt with Martha Foreman, who we talked about yesterday, who lived in Cecil County, Maryland, and had a number of, well, we talked about how she had incorporated her dressmaking and all of her sewing with her African-American slaves, as well as hired needlewomen and so forth. So she did a comparison of the two. Having said that, I decided that the best way to go forward might be to try object biography. Object biography is a way of looking at a quilt from the time it's made all the way through its history until today. And so that's what I'll be talking about, and now I will begin. The exhibit and symposium, Sewn in America, Making, Meaning, and Memory, recognizes the range of connections between textiles and their makers, owners, collectors, and curators. These connections may be tactile, intellectual, and emotional. In fact, those who work with them know that textiles easily entangle us with the materials and makers they contain, and times past and present. This paper presents an object biography of the Robinson Crusoe quilt made between 1800 and 1820 in King and Queen County, Virginia. In her work on museum collections and their meaning, Elizabeth Pereira, a professor at the New University of Lisbon, Portugal, wrote that an object biography is, quote, a collection of sources on how an object was created, who has owned it, where it has been kept, and it reveals otherwise, and I'm going to click for that. Whoops. Yeah. It reveals otherwise overlooked historical actors and introduces new historical perspectives. Well, that's what I needed. I needed some new historical perspectives, and I needed some new avenues for exploration for this. In 1986, Igor Kopytov suggested that the meaning and usefulness of objects changes from the moment that they're created throughout their existence to their final disposal. Usefulness may also be called agency, with agency defined as the ability to influence the behavior, thoughts, or emotions of an other, whether a person or thing, and whether consciously or unconsciously. Object biography was a tool developed by those who practice materiality theory in archaeology, and it also evolved in the fields of philosophy and history. Ian Hodder, a British archaeologist, proposes that objects have agency according to the agendas we assign them, and more importantly, that they entangle us in webs of relationships. The way humans and things interact has a big impact on culture, and if you doubt it, think about this thing. What has this thing done to our culture in the last 20 years? We are so entangled with these devices in our daily lives, and they have changed our culture. Talking about a quilt, it's a little bit different. The Robinson Crusoe quilt, I'll be talking about its biography in terms of the people that it has entangled. So it'll be a more personal view than something like this that's entangled a whole culture. It would be false to say that objects intentionally cause behaviors and reactions in humans. But what is true is that the existence of an object in a certain form draws people into its care and use and into the lives of things. Cell phone charger, a little case to put around it, all those things that go along with an object. I want to make a short disclaimer before I start. An object biography is by necessity an interpretive act involving the interpretation of often incomplete data, requiring inferences and deductions to bridge gaps. So the information that I share here today, it's important for me to acknowledge that there could be other interpretations that are equally valid. The Valentine, a history museum in Richmond, Virginia, currently owns the Robinson Crusoe quilt. It was made at Hillsborough, according to its donor, a plantation house that was built about 1730 in King and Queen County, Virginia. The house is well preserved in its original form, except for a little kitchen and a couple little bathrooms added on in the 20th century. And the family who built the house still live in the house. So there's this remarkable continuity through the time, through the last 250, 300 years with this quilt. The name Robinson Crusoe was given to the quilt by Mr. and Mrs. Edward J. Mosley when they donated the quilt to the Valentine in 1967. In the 1980s and 1990s, the quilt was featured in several exhibits and articles, which I've just mentioned. Frances Baylor Hill, a young woman who grew up at Hillsborough from 1781 to 1800, is most often proposed as the maker. She wrote a detailed diary of her daily activities for the year 1797. Have you all seen that, or is some people familiar with her? She's probably studied a lot. Her diary included frequent sewing and quilting activities, but there's no conclusive evidence that she was the maker, and there may never be. Could have been her and her sisters, or several people could have made it. The persistence of the Hill and Henley families of Hillsborough provided a unique opportunity also to meet with them at Hillsborough and talk to them about the quilt. So I visited them in 2023 and 2024 to learn more about what they felt about the quilt from their perspective. When the Robinson Crusoe quilt was donated to the Valentine by Dr. Mosley in the 60s, 1967, he provided the following statement, and you can see it here. Handmade, homespun, and woven at Hillsborough Plantation in King and Queen County, Virginia, the home of Colonel Humphrey Hill. Chintz imported from England. Ships owned by Colonel Hill brought the material from England. I should explain to you, because I didn't put a good map up. King and Queen County is about 80 miles south of here. It is on a feeder river into the York River, and the York River feeds into Chesapeake Bay. The Mattaponi River is the river that Hillsborough sits right on, and it was a river, that whole trade route was very active during the 18th century. A little bit more about the donor statement, a letter written to the Valentine Museum from the donor's family in 1985 further stated that the quilt was traded to Dr. Mosley by a patient, quote, in payment for a large and overdue medical bill covering many years, end quote. And you will note that this statement says the quilt was made at Hillsborough, but not that it was obtained at Hillsborough. Let's talk about the quilt a little bit now. Because this is an object study, I need to identify the quilt, talk about it a bit, let you know what it's about, the provenance of the quilt, as well as the family in which it was made. And I'll do that for about 10 more minutes, and then we'll have about 15 or 20 minutes on the object biography and the interview. I hope to stay on time. The Robinson Crusoe quilt is a center medallion quilt with a flowering tree of applique printed cotton, which I will refer to as chintz, on a plain cotton background measuring 80 by 90 inches. Four borders surround the center medallion. Quilts similar to this are seen in the eastern United States from the late 18th century through the first half of the 19th century. The innermost border I will start with is whitework in motifs traced from templates indicated by traces of pencil lines. So you can see there the whitework feather on the left. You can see, if you look really closely, some traces of the pencil marks. On the right, you can see a drawing that Linda Baumgarten made for me, comparing templates for these designs to the actual designs on the quilt. And when they are overlaid in the middle, you can see the similarity. She just wanted to make sure that I was able to show that these were drawn from templates. And this stuffed quilting in this border, I will refer to as whitework. I think I mentioned that. The maker constructed the tree and applique borders from block printed chintz, flowers, and leaves, and applique borders from block printed chintzes and flowers and leaves sewn to the background. Another wider whitework border adjoins this, and the outer border is both appliqued and pieced. The outer border displays appliqued flowers, leaves, and birds placed between the peaks of a stair-step border. The chintz fabrics that can be identified date from 1792, perhaps as late as 1820. The quilt maker used an indigo resist over-dyed yellow print with small yellow and white flowers and yellow picotage or little dots to create the stair-step border. And I will just stop for a second to say that if you start in the top left corner and go clockwise, you're seeing the several different chintzes that were used to make the tree. Very gracefully done, very well designed. This is an interesting leaf, one of my favorites, and I don't know if you can see, but it was actually pieced together. There's a seam down the middle of it, so they were using their fabric wisely. Down at the bottom is that wonderful over-dyed yellow block print, and then the little birds down on the bottom left. I can't do left and right very well. On the bottom left are from a completely different chintz. Some people have speculated, and I have speculated, that this might have been made in stages and that this last border was put on after the original quilt was made, the center of the quilt, but we have no solid evidence of that. The stitching is pretty similar throughout. The backing and perhaps some of the front background panels may have been spun and woven at Hillsborough. An insurance policy from the Mutual Assurance Society dated 1802 lists a wooden weaving house 28 feet by 18 feet among the outbuildings, quite a large building. And one of the people I interviewed remembered the foundation of the building when it still existed. It was 2 rooms with a big central fireplace and a lot of room for both of these activities. The building was valued at $520 by the insurance company. Spinning and weaving were tasks that were assigned to skilled enslaved houseworkers on some larger plantations. If that is true here at Hillsborough, the backing fabric and some, if not all, front panels may have been made by the labor of slaves. The quilt is known as the Robinson Crusoe quilt because of a copperplate print figure, and I will probably just say toile from now on, that closely resembles images of the Robinson Crusoe character found in early editions of the novel, The Strange and Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, first published in 1716. On the quilt, the figure stands on his tiptoes, reaching up, and I'm going to advance and come back. On his tiptoes, reaching up toward a bunch of appliqué grapes hanging over his head. Several Robinson Crusoe toiles produced in the, when I turn my head, do you lose me? I'll stop turning my head. Okay. Several Robinson Crusoe toiles produced in the 19th century are known today, mainly because they were very popular and reprinted over time. One was current even in the 1980s. In these, Robinson Crusoe is seen rowing a raft, hunting with Friday, and writing in his journal, but never is he seen on tiptoe reaching upward. If anyone has ever seen this figure, please let me know, because I have talked with Anne Moonen. She has sent this, this toile to colleagues in France. I've talked to the toile experts I know here in the United States. Nobody has seen this. And I'm beginning to think it might have been on a handkerchief or something that was more ephemeral, something that didn't last very long. A reading of the novel suggests a scene from the book that the quilt maker may have attempted to illustrate. And I will turn now. Crusoe is exploring the island in chapter 7 of the book, where he is shipwrecked and discovers grapevines growing on the trees. He knocks down grapes with his stick in order to preserve them. This seems a likely interpretation of this scene. On the other hand, I want to mention that Sandy Fox, in Wrapped in Glory, suggested that the figure could be based on Joseph, the father of Jesus, from a painting by Gerard David. If you see my little circle that I tried to draw, Joseph is way in the back there. He does not play much role in that painting, but it shows Mary and the infant Jesus in the foreground taking fruit from a palm tree that Jesus has caused to bend down. And Joseph is way in the background gathering chestnuts. This painting was known in the colonies, and it could have been known to the maker through her education. But to me, Mary and Jesus are missing from this painting. I think it's more likely to be Robinson Crusoe. Just an opinion. All right, the family. Humphrey Hill was born in England in 1706 and joined his uncle's transatlantic London shipping firm as a young man. He immigrated to Tappahannock, Virginia in the early 1720s. It was then known as Hobbs Hole. Hill married Frances Baylor of King and Queen County and acquired 1,200 acres of land through that marriage. He built Hillsborough on that land in 1730. The house is a large 4-over-4 central hall building of frame with brick end walls on a bluff overlooking the Mattaponi River, where Humphrey Hill built a wharf that goes out into the river where he could land his ships. He was active in the shipping business. He also was a slave trader, and that's probably where he made most of his wealth. I found at least 2 references, advertisements for slaves that he was bringing in, 400 choice. I didn't bring the ads, I didn't include them in this, but he was a slave trader, and that would have been where he made most of his money. Humphrey Hill and Frances Baylor had 10 children. Of the 6 sons, Edward inherited Hillsborough following his father's death in 1775. Edward married his first cousin, Frances Brooke Baylor. They all married their first cousins and had 8 children, including Frances Baylor Hill. Uh-oh, let's go forward. I just leaned on it. I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, we were on genealogy. Humphrey Hill, okay, they got married, they had kids. Edward was the one who inherited Hillsborough following his father's death in 1775. Edward married his first cousin, Frances Brooke Baylor, and had 8 children, including Frances Baylor Hill and Charles Hill. Charles, according to Hill-Henley family members interviewed for this paper, attended Princeton to study law, and this is still a source of pride. He inherited Hillsborough at age 26 in 1816, and this is relevant to the quilt's history. Charles Hill married Susan Fitzhugh Coates of Maryland, and they had 3 daughters. Between 1810 and the mid-1820s, Charles practiced law and held political office from King and Queen County and Richmond, Virginia. A deed of sale shows that Charles sold Hillsborough to his cousin, William Temple, in 1819. So the Hills were out of the house by 1819, but their cousins, the Temples, and later the Henleys, are in the house from then till now. William Temple had no children, but acquired several large properties during his lifetime, which he left to 3 sisters, which is quite remarkable. He left Hillsborough to his sister Elizabeth Temple Henley around 1835. She and her husband left Hillsborough to their son Joseph Henley, and Joseph Henley left Hillsborough to his youngest son, William Todd Henley, and the William Todd Henleys are still there. It's now William Todd Henley III, a very nice gentleman, and his wife, Kathy. So let's get into object biography now that we've got the object cleared out and the provenance cleared up. From the time an object is an idea in a person's head, it has agency. Before she began sewing, the maker or makers of this quilt planned, gathered materials, designed, measured, cut, traced, and drew. She was a skilled needleworker with natural or trained talent for applying principles of composition, such as focal point, color placement, and symmetry. She was familiar with the popular medallion style, tree of life, and whitework quilts, and she spent a lot of time with neighbors, the Temples, the Gwathmeys, the Garlicks, the Semples, and others who gathered frequently at each other's homes to quilt. Frances Baylor Hill wrote on a day in late summer, quote, "We spent the day agreeable, eating, drinking, and quilting," end quote. Each of the fabrics in the quilt and each of the tools have a place in the biography of this quilt, as each was drawn into relationship with it. The English fabrics could have been acquired, and I don't remember if I said this, but Linda Baumgarten, when she went with me on a study visit to the Valentine, identified the fabrics as most likely English. Could have been acquired through the family's transatlantic trade activities. You'll recall in the donor statement that Dr. Mosley said that the fabrics were brought to Virginia by Humphrey Hill. Humphrey Hill died in 1775, however, and these fabrics post-date that. But we have some idea that Edward Hill, his son, continued the shipping concern. The main evidence is this ad I found from the Richmond Enquirer in 1806, advertising for sale 2 sloops and a schooner for sale, plus 3 enslaved watermen. The plain cotton yardage needed for the quilt's backing and background panels was either hand woven in the weaving house at Hillsborough by skilled house servants, imported or purchased locally from stores at nearby towns, Walkerton or islets on the Mattapony River. This account book was actually, we have this account book because it was carried to Maine by a Union soldier during the Civil War and donated to the Maine Historical Society, and then donated back to the Virginia Historical Society. Kind of a roundabout trip, but it lists various items: buttons, silk threads, linen, velvet, muslin, and so on. Frances Baylor Hill also recorded in her diary that she bought needles from a peddler and purchased muslin and other materials from both local stores. One can theorize at least 3 reasons or agendas for making this quilt. First, to complement elegant and functional bed furnishings for her family home. Second, to exhibit her needlework skills, her taste and currency with fashion, and perhaps to earn the esteem of other women in the neighborhood, and to establish her identity in the community as a fine needlewoman. Or she made the quilt to please herself. She enjoyed the creativity of decorative stitching. This is heavily embroidered. As most Southern quilts, the applique is done through embroidery. And it provided a break and time with female friends and family, as Rosica Parker suggests in The Subversive Stitch. And it must be acknowledged that this could have been a project by several makers. When the maker or makers stitched Robinson Crusoe on the quilt, she gave the quilt another agenda. There is a message embedded on this quilt. But what is it? I have no idea. Do you have any idea? I wish someone knew. We can only infer. But this applique really adds interest to the quilt and transforms it from a typical flowering tree medallion, very formal, into something more compelling. What she intended by adding the figure will never be known, but we can interpret or guess. The maker was wealthy enough to have several imported chintzes at her disposal to cut up and applique onto this backing fabric, and was probably also educated either by tutors hired for her siblings or her mother. So she was probably literate. She lived in a rural, though not isolated environment. Perhaps she wanted to demonstrate her currency with the popular novel Robinson Crusoe, and it was incredibly popular in early United States. There were over 100 versions of it published between 1781, I think, and 1820. So it was constantly new editions being published. She might have wanted to show her love of adventure or her admiration of Crusoe's character. So was the agenda fulfilled for this quilt? The quilt itself offers evidence as to whether these agendas were met. Mild fading, staining, and fabric deterioration indicate exposure to light and household use. One can infer that it was used as a bed covering in a room with windows for some long period of time. The quilt does not show the kind of fading or color loss that indicates frequent laundering. But the fabrics used were printed with fast dyes, most of them. I will say, though, the browns and the blacks have deteriorated pretty badly, and they've been repaired by the Valentine Museum with crepeline. The very survival and preservation of this quilt, among so many others, suggests that the maker's needlework skills were greatly admired, and it was viewed as a treasure. I was trying to show on the slides, maybe you can see some of the stains that are on it and some of the differences in colors and fading. So this slide, I want to talk a little bit about entanglement, or about the relationships that have been drawn to the quilt. By the time the quilt was made, it had already drawn several relationships to it. You had local store owners where she may have purchased tools, notions, or plain cotton. Fabric importers, perhaps it was her father who imported the fabric, but at any rate, she had involved the maker in international trade in some way. Enslaved household workers who may have spun and woven the plain cotton for the backing. And the community of neighbors and friends who may have shared ideas with her. Maybe one of them gave her the figure of Robinson Crusoe to put on the quilt, who knows? But from the time that it was created, it had entangled a number of people and things with it. I guess I should turn the page. After the maker's death, her children and grandchildren or other descendants became the keepers of the quilt. As it entered this chapter of its life, it was probably no longer consistently used as a bed cover, but spent much of its time stored away in a trunk or on a shelf or in a closet. At this stage, the quilt had become an heirloom, defined by Oxford Languages as an object of some value passed down through the generations of a family. As an heirloom, the Robinson Crusoe quilt was probably unconsciously assigned a new agenda. Heirlooms preserve memory, recalling a past family member or time period with nostalgia. Those who never met the quilt maker, who lived long after her time, experienced a memory of her through their senses, by touching and viewing the quilt and by hearing other family members discuss its maker. In the article, Heirlooms as Memory, author Kayla O'Daniel wrote, quote, "While heirlooms are passed down through generations, they retain the memory and marks of the maker," end quote. That's probably why we end up becoming fascinated by these textiles and entangled with them. As an heirloom, the quilt drew in the family members, drawing a response from them as they interacted with it. It connected each person who saw it to something bigger than themselves. For family members, that something bigger was a respected ancestor or important event and invoked a satisfying sense of belonging. For enslaved houseworkers, one can hypothesize that a memory of weaving the quilt backing could be embodied in the quilt. perhaps connection to ancestors. It has not been possible to uncover the stories of the slaves, any of the slaves and their families at Hillsborough, but census data shows that there were 60 enslaved workers there in 1810 and 29 in 1820. I'm going to skip one slide here and go on to fold lines. The evidence for this phase of the quilt's life is seen in the deep, discolored fold lines on its surface. They attest to decades spent folded, but well protected and preserved from rodents, moths, Civil War, water damage, and anything else that might destroy it. Dark colored thread. See if I can, did I need to go forward? Nope, back. Nope. Nope. Well, it's not there. Dark colored thread on the back of the quilt may indicate an awkward repair, but ultimately the form and beauty of the quilt demanded care from the maker's descendants. Okay. There, entanglements as an heirloom. The quilt at this phase carried a memory of the maker to the family members who inherited it and stored it. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly who that was. Most of the records of the families in King and Queen County were burned during the Civil War as the Union Army passed through and the Confederate Army passed through. Besides the people the quilt drew into relationship, there were things too: a trunk, an armoire, a shelf in the interior of the house. It had to have been stored in the inside of the house. I don't think anyone put this in a barn. It's too well preserved. This quilt remained in King and Queen County, King and Queen, or King William County during the many years it functioned principally as an heirloom. However, Julia Todd Henley, an informant from the interview, who grew up at Hillsborough in the 1950s and 60s, believes that the quilt left Hillsborough in the early 19th century when Charles Hill and his family sold the home to William Temple, or when Edward Hill died in 1816 and his property was divided. But the quilt may have left Hillsborough even earlier than that. By the early 18-teens, Frances Baylor Hill and her sisters, Nancy and Mary, all possible quilt makers, were married and living in nearby homes. When Frances married her cousin, John Hill, around 1800, she moved to his home, which was called Mayfair in King William County across the Mattapony River. Her sister Mary, her cousin John Hill, her sister Mary married another one of John Hill's brothers. So if one or both of them made the quilt, it probably stayed at Mayfair for some time and then descended through their heirs who married into the Gwathmey family. The quilt's location is made more difficult to track, as I mentioned before, because most formal records were destroyed. And the house itself was occupied by Union soldiers. And William Todd Henley III, the owner now, proudly showed me, and it was really interesting, showed me the hole in the attic ceiling where the Yankee fell through. So yeah. Sometime in the first half of the 20th century, the Robinson Crusoe quilt was traded to Dr. Edward Mosley in payment of a large and overdue medical bill. Dr. Mosley was a resident of Richmond, and so at this point, the quilt left those home counties of King and Queen or King William. The identity of Dr. Mosley was a mystery at the time that I interviewed the family in July, so I looked into the genealogy, and that revealed that Dr. Mosley's wife, Sue T. Mosley, was actually Susan Todd Mosley. So she was from the Todd family in King and Queen, and her mother was Ellen Temple Garlick. These were all names that were in Frances Baylor Hill's diary. Her father was Robert Boyd Todd. And then the identity of Dr. Mosley's mother, I think I'm supposed to change this. Yes, the identity of Dr. Mosley's mother is perhaps even more relevant to the quilt's history. Mosley's mother was Lucy Ann Gwathmey, probably of King William County. Either Dr. Mosley or his wife Susan were somehow familiar with this quilt. They either saw it in their own home growing up or at family gatherings. None of the Hill-Henley family members interviewed have any memory of the quilt ever being at Hillsborough during their lifetimes. And so you can see on this slide that the quilt came down to the Mosleys kind of legitimately. It wasn't just traded away to strangers. These were family members. And that's how the quilt got to Richmond. When the Mosleys acquired the Robinson Crusoe quilt, it had agency as an object of economic exchange with a value determined by the amount of the overdue medical bill. But it continued to function as a connection to King William County and the quilt maker. The memory of the provenance and other details about this quilt survived its years as an heirloom. And the Mosleys were able to share the story in the donor statement made to the Valentine. So even though we don't know exactly where the quilt was all those years, details about where it was made and out of what fabrics and who brought the fabrics to England, even though they were slightly wrong, they survived in a collective memory of the family. And I would say that's due to the object itself, due to the thingness of it, the beauty of that particular object. The Mosleys intended to leave this quilt to their own eldest granddaughter, which would have continued the line of the quilt as an heirloom. Whether we don't know what happened to the granddaughter, but in 1967, the Robinson Crusoe quilt, this is the quilt with the Mosleys. You can see the four families, Hills, Temples, Gwathmey's, and Garlicks. Gwathmey's probably had it. Again, we're entangled with a storage trunk or shelf, the Dr. and Mrs. Mosley, and the heirloom connection to home and family. Okay, in 1967, the Robinson Crusoe quilt was donated by Mrs. Mosley to the Valentine. As a museum object, the quilt was charged with new agendas by the museum, its director, and its curators. It served as a culturally significant object for the education of the public, exemplifying a style of quilting, embroidery, and fine needlework practiced in 19th century Virginia. But as a fairly fragile museum object, it would have drawn curators into relationship with it, of course, and acid-free tissue and boxes and white gloves and crepeline and more. From 1987 to 1996, it appeared in several exhibitions, first flowerings, wrapped in glory, and also an exhibit I didn't mention earlier at the Valentine entitled Quilts of the 90s, the 1790s, 1890s, and 1990s. And that exhibit took place in 1996. It was the first time I saw this quilt. As it was exhibited, each person who viewed it and read the accompanying label experienced it differently. The Robinson Crusoe Quilts Agency was transformed again as it was perceived by visitors and curators, and each person imagined its maker, time, and place far past. In each stitch, it carries the marks and memories of a person who made it. When the Robinson Crusoe quilt was brought out for my study visits in 2019 and 2021, it again exercised agency as a culturally significant needlework object, demonstrating masterful design and stitching to me, to the curator, Kristen Stewart, to Linda Baumgarten. It entangled me, and I have spent 4 years exploring various avenues of research related to it. My connection to it is intellectual, but also emotional. And please admit it, we do get emotionally involved with textiles, do we not? Yes. It has caused me to contact other researchers around the country and into Europe. I've driven to King and Queen County over and over, not just to meet the family at Hillsborough, but to understand the geography and the Mattaponi River as a trade route before the railroads were built. The quilt is no longer available for study visits. Since 2021, the Valentine has carried out a realignment of its collection to represent just the city itself and the 3 immediately contiguous counties. The Robinson Crusoe quilt, as of June, was still at the Valentine, waiting to be deaccessioned to another museum. But I talked to a couple of people this morning that said that the Colonial Williamsburg just got a large pile of quilts from the Valentine, and we're hoping that that's one of them because it'll be a lot easier to study it there. But right now, it's kind of in limbo, but I'm sure Neil Hurst at Colonial Williamsburg will take care of that. So let's talk about the interview for a few minutes, just a very few minutes. On July 16th of 2024, I traveled to Hillsborough, located near Walkerton on the Mattaponi River, to meet with family members recruited by Kathy Henley, resident of Hillsborough. The group consisted of Julia Todd Henley and Sally Henley, two sisters who grew up in the house, sisters Nita Randall and Beth Parrish, who were fourth great-granddaughters of Humphrey Hill and direct descendants of Francis Baylor Hill, Elizabeth Bird Henley, whose grandmother grew up in the house, and then Bet Albert, who was a Gwathmey Hill descendant, and Kathy Henley, the hostess, who lives in the house. We sat comfortably on a sofa and chairs placed in a circle in the back parlor of the house on a 98-degree afternoon, with the shades pulled down to limit the heat and windows closed tightly. A fan blew cool air from the dining room, and we sat in the semi-darkness to talk. Sometime in the last century, a little kitchen and small bathroom were added to the first floor and a bathroom to the second floor. But besides these changes, the house stands much as it was built. And it was amazingly comfortable without modern central air conditioning. I know that that's a very pertinent fact for everyone, but it really surprised me how comfortable it was in that home. The purpose of the interview was to discover how the quilt was perceived by family members. Secondly, it was hoped that talking to the family members who grew up in the house or frequently visited the house would reveal new avenues for investigation, as Elizabeth Pereira suggested. It was quickly clear that only two of the family members present knew about the quilt before 2023. So there had been a major disconnect there. And only one had seen it at the Valentine. However, they were very interested in it. And Julia Todd Henley and Bet Albert, who knew the most about it, had interesting comments to make. Although sound quality is not good, I'd like to play a couple of comments from the family. When I asked, why do you think the maker put the figure of Robinson Crusoe on the quilt? Let's see if this works. Julia Todd Henley answered with this. With the what? Okay, thank you. I got it. Okay. And I hope we can hear this.
Immediately thought Francis Baylor Hill might have done it. So, and that was kind of an attribute. And I remember how much she talked about sewing and clothing. But I also thought, well, we know she was illiterate because she kept a journal, and not all women in that state were terribly literate.
Right.
And I thought, well, she probably read the book. And that was not necessarily true for a great many women at the time. So I thought she was probably well educated, more knowledgeable of maybe popular trends and the average, that they were more connected through various means.
That's that. But I wanted you to hear their voices. I wanted you to hear her voice. The next question that I asked, well, I would say too that Beth Parrish, who was one of the ladies, commented that she thought that the figure of Robinson Crusoe was just a man out hunting. And someone else said that they thought that he was out shooting mistletoe out of the trees, which is perfectly valid. We do that. But the question that actually may have moved research forward was, what do you know about where the quilt was for the 100 years from the time it was made, from the time the maker died and her immediate descendants also, to the time it was traded to Dr. Mosley. This led to a general discussion, and there were 7 people in the room, so it was very difficult to record something clearly, but I have just 2 quick quotes here. They speculated on how and where Dr. Mosley obtained it and may have landed on an answer, which will lead me. This is an avenue for more research. I'll play and let's see. Okay, let me get here. Come back. Okay.
And a huge collection of antiques, decorative objects. One of them was a silver monteith bowl that I think is at might be at Williamsburg now. Very rare, unusual thing. And had fabrics, they had a house full of interesting things. And there were 2 sisters and a brother who were not married, and they were eventually distributed and dispersed.
Yes.
And so as they got older, they may have given some things away.
Right.
Before they totally dispersed themselves.
Okay.
And I have that in the back of my mind, and I'm not sure it's right, but I I think it's really should be addressed. I can't think of Mr. Fishburne. Junior Smite, he's right, remember how
Okay.
Jackson was that brought it to the. I thought he was a person.
Well, you could see there at the end, we had a lot of discussion back and forth. But through the discussion, they decided, these ladies had never sat down before to talk about this quilt together. They had never considered where it might be. And by doing the interview, they began to talk to each other. And they kind of worked out that they think that it might have been at this home called Burlington, which was a Gwathmey house because the Hills married into the Gwathmeys. And I guess the significance of that is that we might be able to go to reason backwards to where the quilt actually was when it was made, to who, if it was Frances Baylor or Mary Hill, did it actually come from Mayfair to this home, Burlington? We might, that's the avenue I'll pursue. And one more quick quote.
Burlington County.
Okay. This is just a little more from Julia and a little bit, this is Bet Albert.
The house was chock full of everything. And so I can see them, maybe if the quilt, it looks like still to the age is in beautiful condition, but somebody might not have thought it was. I can see them taking it in or saying, you know, using it. I have no sense of them having been here for a very long time.
Well, I absolutely, this is just me blathering. Okay, so don't pay attention to that. But to summarize the interview, it was clear that although 5 of the 7 Hill and Henley family members were unfamiliar with the quilt, they recognized the accomplishment of the maker or makers.